Welcome everyone. On behalf of all of us at the HSC Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Vice President Dr. Romero Leggett, we'd like to thank you for making time to join us. For those who are unable to join us today, this presentation will be recorded and posted on our HSC DI Celebrations webpage. My name is Dr. JP Sanchez. I serve as the Executive Associate Vice Chancellor in the Office of HSC DI. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. We will be using a Zoom webinar platform that does not allow participants to address the panelists directly, but feel free to post comments and questions in the Q&A function. And we want this to be interactive, so please do write out questions and comments in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can see the panelists, but the panelists will not be able to see you. And also, please take a moment to complete the pre-assessment in the chat box. This will help us understand your interests and reflections during the month. And with that, I would like to introduce our two distinguished speakers today who are presenting on We Are Forever Foreigners, Understanding Asian Children's Experiences of Anti-Asian Hate Crimes During the Pandemic Through Parents' Voices. Today, we have Dr. Nam, who's an assistant professor of counselor education in the Department of Individual, Family, and Community Education at our own University of New Mexico. She received a PhD in counselor education and supervision from the University of Iowa, and her experience in the field of psychology and mental health counseling includes working with adolescents and young adults dealing with depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, and suicidal ideation and behaviors across multiple settings. Her professional and scholarly pursuits are centered around comprehending and reducing mental health disparities. Currently, her research efforts concentrate on investigating and deconstructing implicit biases in counselors in training, addressing the issues of mental health literacy and stigma within underserved populations, and developing culturally responsive interventions for suicide survivors. I would also like to welcome Dr. Jung, who has completed his doctorate in counselor education and supervision at the University of Iowa as well, and currently serves as an assistant professor of counselor education in the Department of Individual, Family, and Community Education at our own University of New Mexico. He has worked with adults with depression, anxiety, and personality disorders in diverse settings, such as local mental health agencies, a rehabilitation center, and alternative high school. Jung Wang's research interests predominantly focus on the mental health and addiction concerns of marginalized populations, multicultural counseling competence, and multicultural counselor education. So please help me in welcoming our two distinguished speakers.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sanchez, for the comprehensive introduction. So this is Dr. Nam. I also go by SJ. So we will just talk about our recent study on the anti-Asian hate crimes that we've just finished data collection and initial data analysis. So we thought this might be a good topic for this Asian American AAPI Heritage Month, because I think these experiences have been pretty pervasive during the pandemic. And then there hasn't been a lot of discussion of their experiences and also discussions of what we can do to support this population better. So Dr. Jung and I will just briefly go over our study, and then at the end we will have an open discussion where we talk about what implications you can bring to your own profession or for your own field. So before, let me start sharing my screen first. Right, so the title, the We Are Forever Foreigners, this is a direct sentence or the quote that was used in one of our interviews with the participant. So we will kind of go deeper with where that is coming from and what that means to them. So before we start our presentation, maybe we can start sharing maybe your profession or your field, like where you're coming from in the chat, so that we can have a better idea of our audience. So you can kind of share that briefly in the chat. That would be really appreciated.
I have opened the chat for attendees, so you can go ahead and put your answer in the chat.
And meanwhile, if you are done with sharing like, where you're coming from, we will start with a brief ice-breaking activity. It's not an activity, but so we have just come up with one question for you about how you would define anti-Asian hate crimes, because I think we do have a standardized definition of this experience. But then, if you don't mind, this is the. Can you all see the QR code in the shared screen? Okay, yeah. So you're gonna go to the menti.com. You can use your own, laptop, or you can also use your phone with the QR code if that's easier for you. And then you will enter the code over here. And then please share what words you'd use to define an anti-Asian hate crimes. And then I will switch to another screen where we can see all those responses together. Okay, so we are getting some responses like disempowering, unjust, historical, hurtful, discrimination, race-related, misinformed, insensitive, ignorant, right? So these are, so when we started interviewing our participants, we actually had each of the interviewees or each of the participants define an anti-Asian hate crimes using their own understanding, and then we tried to use the definition throughout the participant interviews. So we thought, just because how they conceptualize these experiences and how they see it, how they define it was really important to us. So that's why we started. And then, as you can see over here, our participants actually gave similar ideas around the definition of anti-Asian hate crimes. So they talked about how these experiences include some abusive aggression and also violence, and also how it involves physical, verbal, and also emotional attack towards Asians or Asian Americans. But then they also talked about this doesn't necessarily have to be a crime or legal issue that involves, law enforcement or anything like that. But then if there is anything that is kind of impacting the person, or if that is perceived as a discrimination or even microaggression by the person, that can still also be an anti-Asian hate crime. So our participants were able to give us a kind of broader and also more comprehensive definition of anti-Asian hate crimes, and that we will be using their definitions throughout the presentation today. Okay. So let me start talking about why we actually initiated this study. So we started this study with another, three additional colleagues in our field, which is counselor education and counseling together. And then each one of us self-identifies as an Asian person. And then during the pandemic, it was pretty obvious that there has been an increase in terms of the numbers of, or the frequencies of the anti-Asian hate crimes around the world, especially in the United States. So we thought this is an issue. And then for those experiences, it was pretty frequent that Asian people or Asian Americans were being a target of these experiences, usually hateful incidents during the pandemic. And also, we know, according to the previous studies and also literature, we know that how they impact the person's mental health. So just being in those experiences, even just indirectly, people can be impacted in terms of their mental health, usually kind of fear, depression, and also anxiety. And that also impacts how people develop social, interactions or relationships and how they perform at their schools or job. So we can see how the impact is really large, maybe larger than we might expect. And also the thing is, Asians and also Asian Americans are known to be at a higher risk of mental health symptoms in general. And also we, according to the literature, Asian people, they're not really seeking help, even though they do experience some of the mental health symptoms. So there is a disparity in their help-seeking behaviors or the attitudes, which is also kind of critical to understand. And also another thing, so in Asian Americans and also Asians, these are the populations that are usually understudied in our field. So there is a really limited number of studies that all actually talk about these populations or even with their anti-Asian hate crime experiences. So we thought this is missing in our field, counseling field. So we thought we should kind of look into their experiences. And then we initially employed a phenomenological study in order to understand the phenomenon, which is the experience of the anti-Asian hate crimes among Asian and also Asian Americans during the pandemic. So that was the initial idea where we decided to focus on this topic. But then we went further, trying to focus on the children or the youth. So it's kind of inevitable for this population to be exposed to these experiences, especially during the pandemic. All the medias were talking about it. It was easy to see those incidents on the street or on a random day. So it was almost impossible for the children or adolescents to avoid experiencing these incidents or hearing about it. But then there wasn't a lot of study that specifically focused on Asian or Asian American youth, and also during the pandemic. So we thought it's really important to understand how they experience these incidents and how that has impacted our children and also adolescents. But then we thought just because a lot of children experiencing these incidents, they're still young, and sometimes they're not really protected in terms of talking about or learning about these experiences. So we thought we might want to start with their parents to talk about this experience first. And then we perceived the parents as quality informants who can share their direct interactions or direct observations of their children during the pandemic. So we decided to use their own voices to kind of amplify how their children process such traumatic experiences within the family interactions.
All right, so I'm gonna talk about the method section of our study. So first of all, since we targeted parents who have Asian or Asian American children who went through any direct or indirect anti-Asian hate crime, so we targeted those parents, and also parents who have resided with their children during the pandemic in the US, and also who think their children went through such Asian hate crimes. So about the recruitment, so we initially targeted the people in a state where there is a larger Asian population, such as California, New York, and Texas, New Jersey, Illinois. And also we contacted organizations such as like Asian American or Asian organizations within the States. And also we also posted our study for recruitment in social media such as Facebook. And also we did a snowball sampling because this is a really sensitive, I guess, issues to discuss or talk. So it was really harder to get participants at the first time. So at the first moment when we started recruit, so we also include the snowball sampling method to recruit participants. So about the participants, so we were able to recruit 12 parents of Asian American children, 10 mothers and 2 fathers. And children ethnicity was defined by parents as an American Chinese, Japanese American, Korean American, and Taiwanese. And there were 16 children were involved in this study, 12 girls and 4 boys is identified by their parents, and their ages range from 6 to 16 years old with average of 10.25. So usually the children were like the elementary school kids or the middle school students. And for the interview, we conducted about 1 hour semi-structured interview for each participant, and we include some 6 questions on definitions of anti-Asian hate crimes and also experience and reactions related to the crimes based on their children's perspective and the parents' perspective. Also, we ask some questions on their available resources or unavailable resources at the moment. And then also follow-up questions were asked. About the data analysis, we used the consensual qualitative research called CQR method. So we were able to come up with 4 domains and multiple core ideas for each domain. So first one is parents' understanding of anti-Asian hate crime. That's just what we did, just like what we did for the activity of this session. And second one is the parents' reactions to children's experiences. Third one is children's reactions. And last one is about their resources. And also we did cross-case analysis among the researchers. And also we try to assure the trustworthiness by doing triangulation and member checking. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
I always forget that. So for the CQR, which is one of the data collection and also analysis methods for the qual studies, so we came up with 4 different domains, right? And then under each domain, we identified different categories. And based on the frequency of those categories, we labeled them as general and also typical and subvariant. And then I know this is a large study where we collected a lot of information. So for sake of time, I will not go over every single category today, but then I will try to focus on those more salient and also more frequent. So for the first domain, which was about the parents' understanding of anti-Asian hate crimes. So in addition to the definitions that our participants were able to come up with in the beginning of the interviews, they also talked about how they understand the experiences, how they conceptualize their experiences. So almost everyone mentioned how these experiences or these incidents are racially motivated and also specifically targeting Asians, how it is against Asian people. So according to their interviews, our participants had their own ideas in terms of where these incidents are coming from, like why people are doing it. And then they talked about just because we're not getting a lot of education about differences in races and also how these actions are not allowed in our society. and also how some people are not really exposed to different cultures in the first place, how they're not really exposed to those, diversity at all. And also how some, even within the minority populations, there are still people doing or committing anti-Asian hate crime, and then their understanding was more about internalized racism. So maybe being a minority, being targeted in many different aspects in terms of the discrimination because of the racial difference. Maybe even minoritized people start internalizing those experiences or those negative messages or wrong, messages about a specific population, and they start to mimic those behaviors or the verbal actions. And also they talked about some of the aspects that are considered as internal attribution. So in terms of why people are doing it, why people are committing anti-Asian hate crimes, some of our participants were saying, just because, I don't look like a white, or just because my English is not enough, or just because I don't know American culture very well. So they were trying to find all those reasons within themselves to understand or to conceptualize these experiences, which is also heartbreaking, but then that is considered internal attribution. And also, even though they didn't necessarily use the term microaggression, a lot of their explanations are considered as microaggressive. So they talked about, sometimes I cannot really prove my experiences, or I cannot really explain how that is a discrimination, but I can feel it, right? So they were talking about how it's hard to explain, or it's hard to prove, or it's hard to make a report or anything, but then they could still be feeling how people are treating them differently, or how they're looking at them with different different look, and then how they were kind of embedded within the stereotypes that are pervasive in our society. So even though they don't necessarily think it was an action coming from the perpetrators, they were still able to say how people judge them, or how people approach them with those preconceptions or biases or the stereotypes, and then they thought it is also an anti-Asian hate crime. And also, almost all of my participants talked about how these experiences are not a new thing, right? They all agreed it has been there even before the pandemic or before the outbreak of the COVID, but then maybe it became more frequent, it became more visible due to the outbreak of the COVID. And also, they also talked about these are some experiences that our kids might start experiencing in their maybe junior high or maybe high school years. But then with the outbreak of the COVID, the emergence became faster, which means even children in pre-K or in the elementary school were experiencing this incident due to the outbreak of the COVID. And also they mentioned the panger, which is about the anger towards COVID or the pandemic. And then they were understanding maybe people were just upset or mad at the current situation with the COVID, because I think being in the pandemic, everyone had no idea what was going on in the beginning, and then we had to go through a lot of painful experiences because of the virus and everything, and then maybe some people were mad at this situation, but then they didn't really know how to relieve that emotion, the strong emotions, and then maybe they were kind of targeting Asian people to kind of release that emotions, and that's the panger that they defined during the interview. And also they talked about these experiences are not just limited to Asian people, even though anti-Asian hate crimes itself is kind of targeting Asian population, but then these similar discriminative or microaggressive experiences have been really pervasive, universal across different minority population. So not only that these experiences are shared among Asian people in general, they also talked about how these experiences have been shared across other minorities, and then they were able to connect with other minority individuals during the pandemic because of the shared experiences. So after having those experiences with the anti-Asian hate crimes. Our participants, which were parents of Asian or Asian American kids, they were kind of going through different emotional reactions. So they usually talked about how they didn't know what to do. So they were expressing helplessness, talking about, I couldn't do anything. I didn't know where to go, what to do. The resources were pretty limited. And also, they were trying to do something for the children, though, even though they knew the resources or the informations were very limited. They were trying to talk with the children, kind of process the experience, or discuss the experience with the children, and try to change the environmental or external factors to make the children safe. For example, one of our participants ended up moving their child to another school, or sometimes they had to put their children in different classroom to make them feel a bit safer. And also they try to educate their children in terms of how they can react to those experiences, how they should do, like what they should do, usually involving where to talk at the school after the experiences. So a lot of these experiences, trying to support their children after the incident were involved kind of in their self-educating process, just because they didn't know what to do. So they tried to use some external resources like YouTube or some just internet search, or maybe family members who have a better understanding of these experiences, or just in terms of psychological experiences. They try to reach out to those resources and then try to educate themselves because of the limited information in general. And also, it's kind of a unique characteristic about this population where our parents do not necessarily identify themselves as Asian American. They do identify as Asians, and most of them were born and also raised in Asian countries. But then their children, most of them were born in the States, right? So they do have the citizenship, but then how they define their children's ethnicities were also different. So just because of that kind of status, our participants were kind of confused, thinking, just because my children were born and also raised in America, and then they are Americans legally, but then they're not being viewed or perceived as Asians out there, Americans out there, and then they are like forever foreigners because of how they look and just because they're Asians. And that was one of the largest concerns that our participants expressed throughout the interviews, because it's their country and this is their society, this is their kind of community, but then they're not really, perceived as belonged to it necessarily. So that status as second-class citizens were kind of concerning to our parents. And also to our parents, one of their reactions was to protect their children in general. So even before having direct incidents or direct experiences of anti-Asian hate crimes, our parents already had started to protect their children because they knew their children might have been a target in those experiences because they're Asians. So they tried to kind of not allow their children to go outside during the pandemic, or not letting them to be alone. And they tried to pick up their children at the school, like not letting them to walk home, something like that. So they had to take extra efforts to protect their children. And then some of the children expressed how they were not really satisfied with how their parents were dealing during the pandemic, because they had limited contact with the friends at the school in general.
So the third domain is about children's reactions, and we came up with 5 different categories. So the first one is about confusion. So when they first encounter or experience the anti-Asian hate crimes, the children's, and they actually didn't know how to react, because they don't have any understanding about the racism or where it is coming from. So they thought that it was unfair to getting such treatment by other people, other friends. And also they became curious why people are saying this kind of the statements that are related to anti-Asian hate crimes. Also, many of the children's they showed emotional breakdown. Many of them cried after their experience of anti-Asian hate crime. Also, they tended to isolate themselves. Also, they have experienced like feelings of anger and frustration and discouragement and also isolation as well. So, and about the peer relationship, and sometimes this is really kind of tricky one. Sometimes their friends becomes the perpetrator of the anti-Asian hate crimes because I guess they don't know about it. But so because of that, children's Asian or Asian American children were confused and didn't know how to react to such crime because it's coming from their friends. And also about the reluctance, it's about the reluctance to report such crimes or incidents because, as I mentioned, sometimes the perpetrators were their friends, so they don't want to report them because they're worried about their friendship. And also sometimes they don't want to just make it as a big problem because if once they report it and it becomes a big problem and they just don't like to make any big problem. I think we kind of assume that it is coming from the idea of also multi-minority among Asian or Asian American people in the US. And last one about the resilience and strengths. There were some children who have resilience and strengths, and then they were able to cope with those stress and incident. However, many of children's never experienced such crimes before and didn't know how to react and didn't have resilience or strength. So sometimes they have to reach out to for support, and also it is necessary to educate the children and their parents to get outside resources and also let them know how to self-advocate for themselves when they experience such crimes. And last domain was about the resources. So we came up with 4 different categories. And first one is about the friends. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, yes, friends sometimes becomes a perpetrator. However, the friends sometimes becomes a buffer for against such experiences. So there were some cases that friends who are not Asian or Asian Americans who fought against the perpetrators with the victims. And also about the school and the participants' children's were in schools that has various environments related to the against the anti-Asian hate crime. So some children were in an institution or schools that has zero tolerance against anti-Asian hate crimes. In such cases, they feel more supported and they were able to get over such incidents by asking help or support from the school side. However, many of the children were not in that kind of situations. Also, we have some participants from Albuquerque, and because of the small number of the Asian or Asian American kids in the school, they were not getting much support from institution or school. So, and also about the school counselors, there were a lack of, I guess, connections between children or parents and school counselors. So, and sometimes parents do not really know the role or responsibility of school counselors, and then they didn't they haven't even met the school counselors before. So I guess so we were able to locate such, I guess, this connection between parents and children and school. So which is also huge, I guess, risk factor towards the kids who are experiencing anti-Asian hate crimes. So we thought that the diversity and training and education on both sides for the parents and children and school side is important to make additional buffer for the children who experience such crimes. And also about the social capital, some of children or parents were able to, they have knew the idea of mental health literacy, and they were able to seek some additional outside like counseling support. However, many participants don't know about the idea of mental health literacy, so they don't know what to seek for to deal with such issues. And also one of the participants who saw a support from a religious groups or any community resources such as Korean language schools to seek people who are more like look like their children. And also outside schools, yes, because some participants were not able to get counseling services from their school counselor, so they seek counseling services outside of their school. And also information on resources is about, because they didn't know how to react, so they searched how to educate their children or how to better react to such incidents by looking for some podcast or YouTube video clip for their self-education.
All right. So as I mentioned in the beginning, so just because we as the team are coming from the counselor education and also clinical mental health counseling field, our initial focus in terms of getting the implications out of findings were based on more on the mental health aspects of the children and also the parents. But then we still thought there were some implications that might be applicable for everyone, which is first, we need to talk about the differences between Asians and also Asian Americans, because each Asian person self-identifies differently, and that we were able to confirm that throughout the interviews with our participants. So some of them thought their children were just American, or some people thought that they were just Asian or Asian American. So it was all different. And also this kind of identification can be understood really differently based on their immigration status, like where they're coming from in terms of the countries and everything, or how their family kind of perceives their identity. So in order to work with these populations with a better understanding, first we have to understand how they self-identify themselves in terms of their race and ethnicity. And also there were differences between the identification between the children and also the parents. For some parents, they are kind of first generations. Some are just immigrants. Some were born and raised here, and then they create a lot of differences as well. So the difference between the parents' generation and their children can sometimes cause some confusions between the generations, misunderstanding between generations. So it is really important to understand how that is different. And also, as I mentioned as well, so Asian and an Asian American, these populations are considered the understudied and underserved, at least in our field. But I'm assuming that might be also a case in many other fields, or the professions as well. So as a researcher, we need to intentionally focus on these populations for sure. So that doesn't mean that like Asians have to study Asians, right? But if you, even though you're not like necessarily, you don't really self-identify as an Asian or Asian community, we would like to, call for actions in terms of researching these understudied and underserved populations in your professions. And also, just because learning about this experience, sometimes it is more meaningful to use their own understanding and also kind of based on their own needs, rather than like researchers define everything. So maybe employing some participant-centered or community-based research methodologies or approaches to understand this population might be really significant. So even though our study, which was a call study using the CQR, we didn't necessarily work with the community in the first place to define our research questions or the interview questions, but then we partially used some of the participant-centered approach where we had our participants define anti-Asian hate crimes and they used the definition throughout the interviews. So maybe expanding these kind of methodologies to understand these populations from their own perspective, they might be really meaningful. And also researchers can still play an important role to amplify those experiences or the understandings. And also in terms of disseminating the research findings, I think that has always been an issue, especially when we try to study the understudied population. So not everyone might be interested in this topic or in this population, but sometimes we still have to let the people who are not interested know about our findings, because usually they also have some access or power to make positive changes for this population. So it's such a dilemma, but then I think we as researchers have to seek some additional channels to disseminate our findings, especially out of our Asian or Asian American communities, so that we can actually do something about these issues. So those implications, I thought it would be applicable for everyone who's attending this webinar. But then for now, I would like to open the stage to everyone here attending to think about your own profession or the area or the field, and think about how you can maybe relate the findings to your own work with Asian or Asian American individuals, and also what implications you might be able to bring to your own profession. I know it was a brief summary or brief kind of introduction of our study, but I think there are some important aspects that can always be incorporated to your own work. So I know we cannot really let people speak in this setting, but then we're going to use the chat, and please share what you think in terms of how you can relate the findings to your own field or your work, and also what implications you can come up with. And also, if you have any questions about our presentation or the study, I think this is a great time where you can ask those questions as well.
So if I could just jump in, Dr. Nam and Dr. John, excellent, outstanding presentation. More importantly, the way you've developed the research question and your approach is really community informed with a very strong analysis of qualitative data, which provides a unique richness. I think on reflection, this is not only impacting younger students, but it really impacts all individuals in the community. So for me, and as we support HSC community members to even think about how these experiences affect all of our learners, faculty, and staff, and creating a space to come together to discuss these experiences, the implications, and afford resources, right? Resources internally, but also externally, because sometimes you feel most comfortable in working with community-based organizations off campus. I think that the implications is, my two questions for you is, one, we know that many minoritized communities have different levels of acculturation, and what was the consideration around making these inquiries around individuals who might not have citizenship status and might be fearful in participating in studies because it carries the added burden of taking on, will people know of your, other statuses? And then two, language, because in many communities, English may not be the chosen language to have these conversations that are very sensitive and uncomfortable and emotionally charged. So I don't know how you manage those. And so that's one, so status in terms of citizenship, language. And then third, what are your hopes for doing prospectively tracking of these students given these experiences?
Yeah, that's a hard question. So in terms of the status, so to be honest, we didn't really care about that in our study. First of all, just because we didn't want them to identify or disclose in terms of their, immigration status or anything. But then naturally, some participants talked about where they're coming from, like what they're doing in the States, and that was kind of automatically disclosed. But then that wasn't a consideration for our studies in any aspects at all, just because the population was really small, and that we're aware that might create some differences in their experiences or their conceptualization. But then I thought the sample was too small to consider those differences at this stage. So we didn't really consider that. And the language was a big one. So some parents who have studied and also who've been working in the States, they didn't have any issues with the language. But then many of the parents, as you might have already expected, they all had some difficulties with the language for sure. So we let the participants have the interview questions before the interview. So once we scheduled the interview, we sent out the interview questions and the Zoom link together. And then they had some time to kind of understand the question and maybe try to write some notes about how they're gonna respond to those questions. And we actually literally let our participants to use their own language for the terms that they cannot really translate into English. And they just gave the terms in the chat in their own language, and we sometimes had to use the translator or dictionary to understand what the participants were saying. So there was kind of like extra, I think, opportunity for our participants to explain or express their experiences better. But then I think that's still a limitation of our study, because based on their comfort level with the language, the amount of the experiences or the amount of explanations that they could give to us can be different, right, across the participants. So maybe we might be capturing more experiences of those who are comfortable with speaking in English comparing to those who are not really comfortable with the language English. So that's one of the limitations. But connecting to your third question, maybe we could have hired or invited a translator or bilingual researcher who could have understand at both ends, and that might have expanded the information, the amount of or the depth of information that we could have gathered. So in the future studies, I think we have multiple different directions, but then in terms of the acculturation and the language levels, I think that's one of the considerations that we might want to kind of incorporate into. And for other future studies, so we focused more on the school counseling aspects as well, because that's also one of our kind of professions, right? So how the school counselors were being helpful, or how they were not really supportive, or how they were available in general. And then we thought, I think at the school counselor level, like they were going through a lot of things as well. And there was one of the research questions that we identified after analyzing our data, like what they were thinking, like how they were experiencing, how they were being supported by the school in general or the society, so that they could support the student. So that's one of the directions that we are also thinking as well. And Dr. Jung, do you have any ideas for the future directions?
I mean, just the same thing. Yes, I think there is some disconnection between school counselor and then just school itself. So that I know that school counselors, they have different responsibilities, and one of them is about like counseling students, and besides that, they have other responsibility, including taking notes and scheduling and all the other workloads. So we were kind of assuming that the number of school counselors are not enough to support all the students in the school usually. So yes, that's also, I guess, one of the some qualitative and quantitative future researches that we are interested in as well.
Yeah, and also just because, throughout this study, we confirmed how these experiences are really pervasive and also impactful. We thought we need to understand where that is coming from, really. And then according to our participants, they talked a lot about how the kids are not really being educated by their parents, especially for those kind of committing anti-Asian hate crimes. So maybe at the school level or the community level, we really seriously think about how we can educate and train our students in general, to let them know how it is not, okay to say things or to do some things against other racial or ethnic minority kids. So I think that means we need to build some partnership with the school district to kind of involve those trainings or educations at the school level. So that might also be another direction for our future studies as well. Does it answer your question? Thank you.
It does. And, I think it's just the complexity of serving our communities.
Mm.
And also, I love you bringing up the role of teachers, because have the teachers developed an awareness of the diversity of students, right? And how to work with parents and community-based organizations. So once again, just excellent presentation, like research question, presentation, and delivery. So thank you for your hard work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So if there are any other questions, speak up now or put in the chat box. We'll hold for about 30 additional seconds. And then, as a reminder, please complete the post assessment in the chat box. This allows us to give continued feedback to Dr. Nam and Dr. Jung, and also to provide information on our upcoming activities. Remember to check out the HSC Celebrations website for the next two activities for Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I'll just quickly pull it up while we're waiting to see if anyone else has questions. So next for the month, please join us for Building Community, Finding Your Food, Fun, and Family in Albuquerque. Very relevant to the topic we heard today, community support is critical to support all community members. And this is being led by Dr. Jay Xu. And then Asian American Pacific Islander History Month Trivia Night, appetizers and prizes on Thursday, May 18th. And that is also a hybrid format. So with that, I think we're going to close out for today, but thank you again, Dr. Nam and Dr. Zhang. Please let us know if we could support in any way your great work, and we look forward to future presentations.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today.
Yeah, thank you.